going to wait we're going to wait for another 30 seconds or so to make sure that everyone's connections have stabilized, and then we'll begin the meeting. Okay, well, welcome back to the 2020 West Region Virtual Cooperative Soil Survey Meeting. My name is Dr. Colby Brungard. I'm an assistant professor of pedology at New Mexico State University, and I will continue to be your meeting host today as well as tomorrow. In case you're curious, behind me is a sodic haplogypsid from southern New Mexico. It has an interesting exposure of a paleosol in the lower portion of the profile. Today we have really a unique opportunity to travel around and explore soils and landscapes from all over the western US. We'll follow the agenda that's on the screen. This is the same agenda that you received via email. The only minor change to the presentation schedule is for Alaska. The presentation will be given by Dr. Nick Jelinski from the University of Minnesota rather than is listed, rather than Michael, his student. Questions will be slightly different today than yesterday. Rather than ask questions of every speaker when they're done presenting, we have a dedicated question and answer session at the very end of a session or a chance for a question and answer period after all the presenters have finished. If you do have a question for an individual speaker, please use the chat option to ask your question. A little button at the bottom of your screen that says chat. If you will type out the presenter's name and then your question, I will collate all of those questions, keep track of them, and then I will read your question back to the presenter during the Q&A session so that the presenters can answer the questions now. I believe this will help avoid any feedback and make the conference run much smoother. This is a great resource, chance to see all of these soils and landscapes from different parts of the western US. And this conference is being recorded. If you want to refer back to any of these presentations, they'll be available perhaps in about a week after the conference. They'll be on the West Region Cooperative Soil Survey Conference webpage that's hosted by the NRCS. As a brief reminder, unless you are the presenter, I recommend that you turn off your mic and your video to avoid any unnecessary sounds and also to reduce your bandwidth. With that, we're just going to jump straight in to the conference. Our first presenter is Dr. Brandon Besselmeyer, and we'll just, once he's done, the next presenter, Stuart Veith, will go into that format. So with that, Brandon, we'll turn the time over to you.
All right, thank you, Colby. Okay. So, welcome everybody, and thank you for the invitation to talk to you. Colby asked me to talk a little bit about ecological state mapping. So this has a little bit of a methodological bent to the presentation, but I'll also try to introduce you to some of the ecological site concepts and state concepts that we're working with in the Jornada Experimental Range landscape. So this area is in Major Land Resource Area 42.2. This is the Southern Desertic Basin, plains and mountains.
Brandon,
Yes, yes.
right now I'm just seeing your video and not your presentation.
I know, Kobe, we can see the presentation.
You can? Then it must be.
Yes.
I apologize.
Okay.
Okay.
Good.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, this is my dual screen is confusing to me too. And so we're typichoritic, thermic, and the 8 to 10 inch precipitation zone. That little purple circle that you're seeing there is the location of the USDA ARS Jornada Experimental Range. And what ecologically characterizes this area, which receives about 233 millimeters of rainfall per year, we're right at the boundary of the arid and semi-arid climates. And so, some years it's arid, some years it's semi-arid, and then of course, soil properties really mediate the plant available water. So it's in many ways a tension zone between perennial grasslands and xeric shrublands. And so that top image here, you can sort of see this little red box. That's a transect between two mountain ranges across the Jornada Basin. The basin floor with oostic calciargids, you tend to see grass-dominated vegetation up on the alluvial fans, where we often have calcic petrocalcids. These have historically been shrub-dominated. So we see lots of varying ecological potential across the basin. And I'm going to focus the next part of the discussion on the majority of the Jornada Basin, which is a relic basin floor landform that has aeolian sands over mixed alluvium of the Rio Grande River. And so these are generally sandy soils. And what we've seen, so we're a long-term research station. We've been around since 1915 measuring vegetation, and we've measured this ecological transition from perennial grasslands dominated by black grama to shrublands dominated, for example, by honey mesquite. And you can sort of see in that middle image there, 1952, that was a very dry period, very severe drought over about 6 years, coupled with mismanaged grazing that really triggered a transformation from the perennial grasslands of the past to the mesquite dunelands that we see now. So there's really three main processes with regard to the state and transition model that I kind of want you to take home as far as a lesson from the Jornada Basin. First is that poorly managed grazing during drought is really a key initial trigger. Those still can happen usually in very patchy contexts nowadays, but of course in the 1950s and the 1930s, these sorts of transformations were widespread. You can sort of see what the Jornada looked like in the mid-1930s. With very, very heavy overgrazing. The second process is that once you kind of cause this loss of perennial grasses, that shrubland state expansion is going to be largely independent of grazing due to soil erosion feedbacks. And then the third process that's really important is that subtle soil variations really regulate the propensity for state transition. So in an area that's managed similarly, if you have, for example, less clay in the subsoil, that may make it more vulnerable to a transition from grassland to shrubland, whereas the grasses will be sustained in areas with more clay in the subsoil. And so this kind of leads up to this idea of the mosaic of ecological states across the Jornada Experimental Range. and the idea that different ecological states of the state and transition model can coexist at the same time on the landscape. And this is what we try to do with ecological state mapping. It's just like soil mapping, but we're mapping the ecological states within the ecological sites. There's a couple of rules that we use in developing ecological state maps. The first is that state polygons occur within ecological site polygons. So every color you see there represents a different ecological site and a group of soils associated with that ecological site. And then the second mapping rule is that we use generalized state classes that are standardized across ecological sites and state and transition models. So for example, in bottomland, we have a grassland, an altered grassland, a shrub invaded grassland. And similarly, we have that on clayey and loamy ecological sites. So in my 8 minutes, which I am rapidly extinguishing, I can't go into this table in a lot of detail, but we do have specific rules for defining the state classes from grasslands, altered grasslands that usually have a reduced abundance or cover of species of interest. And there's a couple of different ecological potentials through these state codes shown in yellow. And then of course we have some miscellaneous classes down below. And so what we do, and this is the third rule for mapping, is developing state associations for mapping finely intermingled states, sort of like a soil mapping association or consociation. So for example, when we see 650, that means that the dominant state that we're seeing in this polygon is a shrubland followed by a shrubland or shrub dominated patches, depending upon where you are in this polygon. And so essentially what we're doing then is that this is an example of a state and transition model for the sandy ecological site. We have a specific characteristic for each of these states. We have specific criteria based on species composition, but each of these states generalizes to a particular state code, and then we can work across multiple state and transition models to map these codes out on the landscape as a basis for management. And so we end up with a map that looks like this, with lots of detail, not only on the ecological potential, the ecological sites, but also in the variety of ecological states. And this is what we're using as a basis for our livestock management program. And we've also conducted a lot of this work throughout Southwest New Mexico that the Bureau of Land Management is using as part of their permit lease renewal process, as well as for planning management activities. So that's all I got. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. So just as a brief reminder, if there's any questions, please type them into the chat box. I'll collate those for each individual speaker, and then we will ask those questions at the end. So let's move on to the next speaker.
All right, I'm trying to get this to start here. Okay, my name's Stuart Veit. I'm the MLRA Soil Survey Leader up here in Havre, Montana. I'm here to do a presentation about the state soil of Montana, which is the Scoby series. And this is a picture of a typical landscape of Scoby taken southwest of Havre here. And chief use and management is dry land wheat. Okay. You can't talk about Scoby without mentioning Leonard Frederick Giesecker, who's kind of the first soil scientist to map in this area. He worked out of Bozeman, Montana at the Ag Research Station in the State College. He started work up here in 1921, and the reason they start up here is because this part of the state had the best farmland. And also, North Dakota had finished their survey in I believe, 1908. So he started over the northeastern part of Montana, and of course he found similar soils to North Dakota as he worked his way west. But as he went further west, he discovered, the soils are getting, lighter colored, and there's less organic matter, and they're not as productive. And that's kind of really where the whole concept of Scoby came from. And I also like to mention he was a delegate to the first International Congress of Soil Science, which I thought was pretty cool. Okay, here's the map. He got to map this whole area pretty much by himself with an assistant. I do own most of these surveys because they're pretty awesome. You can kind of see here, I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but this northeastern part here, this pink color, that's mostly Williams soil. That's that North Dakota soil. And then as you get over here, you get more of your Scoby type soils. Now back then, they weren't really, I guess, too concerned with, is it fine, loamy, those sorts of things. They were more interested in the color of the soil. So this is from Marbot 1935 from the U.S. What's it called? Atlas, Agricultural Atlas. And it shows here, you can see North Dakota. This green area kind of corresponds with what they call the black or soils, or the true Cairnosims in European classification. Then you get into the very dark brown soils and what he called the dark brown soils. And then right over here in kind of a rain shadow, we have the brown soils. Canada has a similar system. Now, of course, they don't line up. And part of that is because brown, dark brown, black is all kind of subjective. And even Ezekiel himself said, yeah, even on the ground, anywhere between 3 and 50 miles, that's kind of a transition zone. So it's not always easy to tell, especially on a flat till plane. It also corresponds to the soil moisture regimes recognized by the NRCS. So Scoby lives up here in north central Montana, where it is erratic gustics. You get between 250 and 350 millimeters of precipitation, about 10 to 14 inches on average. I do like the Coop and Geiger climate classification. It kind of shows most of Montana here is a cold, semi-arid climate, which I do think it is. And here, right here, MLRA 52 in north central Montana is where Scoby lives, and it's known as the brown glaciated plains, although I kind of prefer northwestern glaciated plains because we have a lot of brown and dark brown soils all kind of mixed together. Anyway, what is kind of interesting here is the precipitation loss of evapotranspiration. If you notice here, these orange areas have a value greater than 1, which means that for all the rain that we get, it's all lost. So orange more or less means that areas with fractions greater than 1 are agricultural counties that either import surface water or mine deep groundwater. So we rely a lot here on mining water from down below from the bedrock, and not so much in the soil profile. So I got to keep it going here. Okay, so just kind of to go along with the dryness, you can kind of see here, you look at the prairie pothole regions, and you get out here into Montana, it's pretty dry. We just don't have as many ducks or as many potholes, and we don't have too much of a water table. If you do have a water table, you probably have a saline seep. Anyway, just here's a quick climate zone that Scott Brady, our ecologist, and I came up with. And it kind of shows MLRA 52, where you would find Scoby. And up here is our dry grassland, which would look like this, kind of a western wheatgrass, needle and thread, kind of mixed grass, prairie. And we also have this in the southern part of the area. We have a big sagebrush zone we call the dry shrubland, and there you kind of see western wheatgrass, needle and thread, and a lot of Wyoming big sage. Okay, so here's the extent of Scoby. That's where it really exists. That's where they tell you exists. They pretty much just show the whole array on the state website. Anyway, a profile of Scoby, we got this at the Conrad Ag Research Station in northwestern part of the area. Typically, you find a dark plow layer. You find an argillic that's clay, it'll have clay film. You start picking up some carbonates, pick up more carbonates, and then you'll get down here and you'll get some gypsum, which is very interesting. Now, it's classified as a fine iridic argillaceous. As I said, they weren't always fine. That's just something that happened in the late 60s, early 70s. So, speaking of salt, solubility and horizons, pretty much like this, because we don't have enough precip to push all the salts out, you will find in the lower horizons magnesium and sodium sulfate, and above that gypsum, and above that actually sometimes you find bicarbonates and then carbonates. Okay, so I'll give you a quick rundown here on the glaciation, which is super fascinating, but I probably don't have enough time. Anyway, you can see here, this is about 20,000 years ago, this area was glaciated. We also have areas that were glaciated 140,000 years ago, not too important. North Dakota was glaciated about 14,000 years ago. Okay, so this whole area at one time drained to Hudson's Bay. You can see here, this is Hudson's Bay, and this is the Montana state line. So as the glacier came from the right to the left, it primarily went uphill. So whatever was in the way kind of got ground up and turned into till. And you can see here from this map that most of Montana, the till is very shallow. I'd say it averages between 1 and 10 meters, probably about 5, maybe less. Okay, we have two main types of paramaterial. We have sandstone and shale. Here's where you find your sandstone. Here's the glaciated sandstone landscape. As you can see, the till is not that thick. As you get further down, you get some sandy areas anyway. You get Telsted Joplin. I am running out of time. These series used to be Scoby, but in the 60s they decided to make Scoby Fine Family and Telsted Fine Loamy. We'll just skip that. It's a very complicated area. I don't have time to really talk about it. Okay. Here, Scoby, since it's Fine Family, it's mactitic. It's more in this shale, in this clayey till. So as the glaciers go from north to south, they pick up more shale. In Valley County, here's some shale with a little bit of till over it. That's probably only 1 or 2 meters thick. Here's a typical landscape where you find Scoby. So you find Scoby is your darker, thicker RGF dull. On your back slopes kind of coming up, you get the Kevin series. It's not Kevin. It's thinner. It's about 10 inches or less to lime. And then on the convex portions of the landscape, you find an inceptisol called Hillon. I guess they call it Hillon because it's on a hill. And here, I guess, for a final thing, 2015, we had some fourth graders at Longfellow Elementary School of Bozeman who helped rally and get Montana to be the official state soil, which it became on May 7, 2015, and I am out of time. So hope you learned something. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Stuart. I appreciate that.
Can you hear me, Colby?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, great. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rob Ballard. I'm a soil scientist with the Terrestrial Ecological Unit Inventory of the Forest Service Region 3. I'm stationed on the Coronado National Forest in Tucson, Arizona. And today I'm going to be presenting an Esri story map. This is my first story map, so I had a couple issues with publishing. Unfortunately, I don't yet have a link to share, but thanks for learning a little bit with me on this. So my goal with the presentation is to introduce you to the Huachuca Mountains and talk a little bit about fire ecology and then discuss one of our TEY map units. So last summer, we began field work in the Huachuca Mountains. of southeastern Arizona. The range is roughly 755 square miles in area, or approximately 483,000 acres. Not all of that acreage is administered by the Forest Service. There is a U.S. Army installation, Fort Huachuca, on the north end of the range, and then the National Park Service has the Coronado National Memorial on the southeast end of the range. There's a wilderness area here that encompasses approximately 20,190 acres. That's the Miller Peak Wilderness. That was established in 1984. I've got a quick bit of information about what TEUI is. The Terrestrial Ecological Unit Inventory is a system to classify ecosystem types and map ecological units at different spatial scales. The system distinguishes among land areas that differ in important ecological factors such as geology, climate, soils, hydrology, and vegetation. Maps and information about ecological units are applied in land use planning to describe land capability and identify suitability for various uses. And I do have a link here to the Forest Service TEUI homepage. Hopefully when I am able to share this story map, you could follow that link. So next I have a table from Sean Sally and others from 2016. I like this table that shows the Forest Service National Hierarchical Framework of Ecological Units and how that corresponds with NRCS classifications. So here on the Coronado, we are mapping a land type phase, ecological units, which is this sub 1 to 24,000. And that roughly corresponds with a second order soil survey. So next I have a rapid fire geologic history of the Huachucas. So a shallow sea covered much of southern Arizona throughout, oh, I think I might have. Yep, the story map strikes. Okay, there we go. So a shallow sea covered much of southern Arizona throughout the Paleozoic era. This ultimately led to the formation of various sedimentary rocks. The oldest limestone in the Huachucas is the Naco group, which is approximately 258 to 320 million years old. This image is a rendering from Professor Emeritus of Geology at Northern Arizona University, Ronald Blakey. And I've got a link here to other renderings that he has done of paleogeography of the southwestern United States. They're really fun to look at. So moving on, during the Mesozoic era, there was widespread volcanism, including 3 different volcanic eruptions surrounding the Huachucas. The closest volcano created the Montezuma caldera, the remnants of which are presumed to be within the Coronado National Monument today. And then late in the Mesozoic era, we had the Laramide orogeny, which of course gave us the Rocky Mountains. But here in Arizona, there was widespread thrust faulting and initial mountain building for several of our mountain groups. And following that, the basin and range formation around 15 million years ago led to block faulting and the creation of what we call sky islands. These are our mountain groups that you can see here, shaping southern Arizona as we know it. So with that, I've got a little map here of the superficial geology of the Miller Peak Wilderness outlined in black. You can see we've got an array of intrusive and extrusive igneous and various sedimentary rocks. So moving on, I'm going to talk briefly about the natural vegetation of the Huachucas. So I mentioned sky islands. The Huachucas are part of the sky islands of southern Arizona. Sky islands are small mountain ranges with a high degree of elevational prominence from the surrounding semi-desert grassland. And geographically, this area represents the link between the Rocky Mountains to the north and the Sierra Madre Occidental to the south. This next image is a collection of pictures that I've taken of the various ecosystems that we have across the Sky Islands. The only one shown here that doesn't occur in the Huachucas is this Sonoran Desert, which is the keystone species of that here is the giant saguaro. The Huachucas are in MLRA 41, which is the southeastern Arizona Basin and Range. And that's most of the Coronado National Forest is MLRA 41, although we do have here in Tucson at the base of the Santa Catalina Mountains, we've got some MLRA 40, which is Sonoran Basin and Range. This next map is Brown and Lowe's biotic communities of the Southwest. Again, showing the Miller Peak Wilderness here. We have predominantly, maybe my legend will load, Madrean evergreen woodland and the Petron montane conifer forest. And finally, another resource here is the USGS Southwest Regional Gap Analysis. Again, showing the Miller Peak Wilderness where the dominant looks to be Madrean upper montane conifer, oak, forest, and woodland. So here's one issue I encountered with the story map. I have an animation to show you here that did not load when I published it, but I have it in a different link. And this is just to show you that this landscape has been heavily influenced by fire. Since 1988, there have been about 5 fires that burned some portion of the wilderness area. The largest was the Monument Fire in 2011, which totaled around 32,000 acres with about 6,700 acres of wilderness burned. There have been other fires in this time period to the north and west of the wilderness, but I restricted this to just what has burned within the wilderness. So all of this so far is just to show you a bit of the research that we like to do before we enter an area for mapping. And with fire in mind, I'm going to introduce map unit 505. So map unit 505 is a complex with 2 major components. Component 1 is a typic RG-Udall occurring on colluvium over residuum from granite. And the potential natural vegetation subseries is Douglas fir, Arizona pine, and Gamble oak. This is also known as mixed conifer frequent fire ecological response unit. Ecological response units are a separate mapping effort from Region 3 that shares similar concepts with TEUI. So component 1 is in fire regime group 1, which means low severity fire. It's frequent fire occurring every 9 to 22 years. Component 2 is a Udic RGS occurring on colluvium over residuum from granite. And the potential natural vegetation subseries is Gamble oak and Netleaf oak. Now it is in fire regime group 4, which is much different. It has stand replacing fire occurring every 35 to 200 years. So here we can take note that these 2 components occur at the same elevation with the same aspect and on the same parent material and geology. The difference is the climate and the plant community. It's likely that component 2 was once the same as component 1, dry mixed conifer, and at some point in history it experienced stand replacing fire, which is uncharacteristic for dry mixed conifer. In component 2, we do not see evidence of Doug fir regeneration, so it's likely that the microclimate is no longer favorable for Doug fir to reestablish. So a new plant community with a new potential has taken over and created what we see today, which is a Gamble oak shrubland that is maintained by stand replacing fire. So here's some site photos. On the left, we have the dry mixed conifer component 1, and on the right, the Gamble oak shrubland component 2. So this area last burned in 2002. However, it's likely that the Gamble oak shrubland and the dry mixed conifer existed in a mosaic prior to that. So I have another site photo here with a line. The black line's approximately 7,000 feet of elevation. We're standing at maybe around 6,000 feet and looking up at map unit 505 above the black line. And you can see that pattern in the vegetation. So in conclusion, just a quick statement here. Uncharacteristic wildfire intensity can lead to a redistribution of 4 species. The feedback loop that exists between soil, climate, and vegetation becomes disrupted by fire, and a new community can establish under an altered microclimate. That's all I have.
Thank you, Rob. We appreciate that.
Dan Matke.
Yes, Dan, we can hear you.
All right, I'll share my screen. Can you share my screen? Can you see my screen?
Yes, yes, we can.
Okay. So I'm going to go over a catena of hydric soils in western Wyoming, Sublette County, Wyoming. At first, I was going to just go over calcareous hydric soils, but in this catena, there's varying degrees of calcareous properties among the hydric soils that I think are kind of important to go over. So I will begin my presentation now. So the catena is located in MLRA 34A, cool central desertic basins and plateaus. It's kind of on the upper end of 34A. The precipitation zone is getting a little higher, 15 to 19. So it's kind of not in that central concept of 34A. Here's a general, it's located within the Sublette County Soil Survey area, Wyoming 635. Like most of our soil survey areas in the western US, we have a fairly small percentage of hydric soil components. For instance, in Sublette County, Wyoming, it's 3.7%. And if we look over to the other one, the specifically soils that meet carbonatic mineralogy, it makes up about 14% of the components. So it's a fairly large amount. So the catena area is located in the Horse Creek drainage, which is a tributary of the Green River. The primary land use is ranching, hay production, and cattle grazing, that kind of stuff, pretty common. It's a pretty good wildlife area. Lots of wildlife, good moose population. Really large antelope migration goes through that area, and of course the sage grouse, so in the uplands. And they also like using some of the wetlands to get their forbs for the chicks. So this is a kind of a cross section facing west. In the far background is the Wyoming Range Mountains. Those are predominantly sedimentary with kind of a pseudo metamorphic type of rock, limestone, interbedded sandstone and shale. In the uplands to the far north, there's coarse-grained mountain fan deposits that came from the Wyoming Range through some kind of depositional event. And then to the south, there's more rolling hills, Wasatch Formation uplands with intermixed fan deposits that have kind of rounded rock and cobble deposits. Then as we get into the Horse Creek proper, it's mostly quaternary alluvium in the whole river bottom. And there's a pretty large area of irrigated hayland that's coarse grained, gravel, cobble, that kind of stuff. There's a wild flood type of irrigation going on there, so we have water kind of all over the place. All right, and then if you can see here, I don't know if you can see my pointer there, that's where the concentrated area of hydric soils is. And then there's also the river bottom, which is Holocene age deposits, the youngest deposits there. Okay, so here's a breakdown of the percent hydric components in the catena area. And as we go from west to east, I'll go through the percentage here because it kind of increases as we go east. So map unit 2227 is 10%. Map unit 2116 is 90%. Map unit 1111 is 100%. Map unit 2108, 100%. As we get to the river bottom here, that Holocene age deposit, map unit 2114 is only 35%, and map unit 2113, which would be kind of a lower stream terrace, has 10% hydric soil components. So here's some distinguishing features of the hydric soils here. So here's the Todd Hole series. That one is has a carbonatic mineralogy, fine loamy over sandy skeletal, typic cryoqueous. So there's 3,800 acres in the soil survey area. It does not form redoxomorphic features due to low iron content. We can get into that one later. So it has high value, low chroma, looks like a calcic horizon, and it formed under wet conditions. It has a unique ecological site that has some kind of rare species to the area there. And the water table isn't necessarily associated with the normal stream hydro period. So if we look at this here, this was actually a study conducted by University of Wyoming. This is a water table monitor they did throughout the year. And as you can see, the normal stream hydro period, well, the water table sensors here have the max high in March and April, when we typically see our higher water tables more in May and July that are related to normal stream hydro periods. So this Todd Hole series is getting kind of a different type of hydrologic regime than the adjacent river is. Then we have the horsegrass series, which kind of coexists with the Todd Hole series. All right, in a separate map unit though. But that one's non-problematic, but it does have a diagnostic calcic horizon, and it's of a little larger extent. And it's dominated more by a sedge type plant community. All right. So then we go into, there's some small pockets of typic cryohemist located kind of interfingered with Todd Hole and the horsegrass series. And that's a very rare soil component in the soil survey area. We only identified 360 acres in the soil survey area. And then the moose flat, that's located in the river bottom. All right, so it forms redox, looks like your common hydric soil in the area, located in concave positions along along floodplains. So we see that all the time in this. That's a normal type of situation with the hydric soil in the soil survey area. So here's calcium carbonate by depth. All right, and I threw in a couple of these upland soils for reference here too. So as we move along the Katina from west to east, we have the Lomas Park, which is non-hydric. That's in the upland. So that one has 10% maximum calcium carbonate. Kimrush has 5% maximum calcium carbonate. Both of these soil series are underlain by coarse grain material, gravel, and cobble. As we move over to the horsegrass series, this kind of looks like your typical series with a diagnostic calcic horizon here. So we have minimal carbonate up top, and then we have that pretty large bulge there, all right, giving us the diagnostic calcic horizon. And it's also underlain by gravels and cobbles like everything else. Then we move over to the Todd Hole series, the really white pure calcium carbonate series, pure in calcium carbonate. So we go way over, almost to the surface. We have almost 40% calcium carbonate by weight to the surface. University of Wyoming did some analysis on it, and they had 70% calcium carbonate by weight to the surface there. And then we go into the river bottom. Moose Flat is considered hydric, but it has very minimal calcium carbonate development. And then typic cryohumus has very minimal calcium carbonate development there. So is calcium carbonate telling us some story of related to hydropodology? And I have a couple questions out there that I always have ringing in my head here. Is this simply a deposit? And I got to say no, because it's pretty difficult to explain the purity of the calcium carbonate. Is this groundwater discharge depositing the calcium carbonate through accretion? I think that's a pretty solid possibility there, especially considering that we have this kind of hydrology going on. And if this is what's going on, is this process still active? Is horse grass eventually going to kind of go that direction that Todd hole is at? And we can also find other similar relationships throughout the soil survey area that point to this direction of hydropodology too. But the one thing that is kind of, you know, I can't wrap my head around is the relief down there. It's really, really flat. So explaining the slope hydrology is kind of difficult out there. And here's a few sources, and that is it. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right. Hi, my name is Julie Baker. I'm a soil scientist in the Sonora Soil Survey Office in California. And I'm going to talk about a few high elevation cryotic soils in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks.
And can you, are you sharing your screen here with us? Hit that green button again, that share screen.
Let's see.
And then choose what desktop you want to share with. There you go, perfect.
All right, sorry about that. Okay, so I had a lot of fun looking through all the pictures from the park, and I hope you guys enjoyed it too. So just to get you oriented, we're gonna go visit some soils in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Park, which is this blue area. Here's the Sonora Soil Survey Office. It's kind of on the border of MLRA 18, which is the Sierra Nevada foothills in orange, and MLRA 22A, which is the Sierra Nevada mountains. And the cryotic soils that we're gonna visit are along the crest of the Sierras here in white. And since we're talking about these high elevation soils, I just wanted to give you an idea of the range of soils that are found in Sequoia and Kings Canyon. So it's a really large elevation range, and it spans temperature regimes from thermic all the way down here at about 400 meters up through the highest point in the continental US at Mount Whitney, up on the crest over 4,400 meters. The precipitation in the park as well varies quite a bit, but most of it is xeric. The geology is mostly granitic, and all of the soils we're going to visit today are granitic. And the vegetation also ranges from blue oak woodland down here in the thermic through mixed conifer forest, subalpine forest, up through these alpine fell fields, which is the land of like the teeny tiny pretty flowers. And the soils that we're going to look at are over here along the crest, just north of Mount Whitney. Okay, so when I was asked to give this field trip, I talked to some of the people who had done work in the park, and I was like, oh, you know, maybe I should talk about, we have some new soil series that we've developed for the giant sequoia forest, which is a really iconic part of the park. They have redox, they're really cool soils, and everyone told me, no, we want to see talus soils and rocks. So apologies if it's not your thing, but it's what the people wanted. And this is kind of an extreme example. And if you look really closely in here, you can see there's some actual soil in there. This soil is fragmental, but it's pretty common on talus slopes in the park. Okay, so I wanted to visit some glaciated versus unglaciated soils. And in Sequoia and Kings Canyon, it's pretty evident in rocky areas where there's been glaciers, scraping everything clean, versus areas that have been above the glaciers and are very steep and usually very windswept, and so they don't accumulate much snow. So just to orient us, so this is corresponds to our red rectangle from before. We're going to look at 3 soils, 2 unglaciated. This is the mesa or mountaintop will be the first soil that we'll visit, which is this polemonium series. Then we'll look at a soil on a side slope or a talus slope, which is the Canis rock series. And then finally, just for comparison, we'll go down into a glacial valley bottom and look at the Siberian series. I just wanted to take a minute to acknowledge all the people that have helped on the survey. I counted in NRCS all of the different describers that we've had, and it's been 20 soil scientists mostly from California, but also other places. And some are still around, some have retired, some have moved to other jobs, but it's been definitely a team effort. So in homage to all the help that we've had, this was from a lab sampling trip. So before we get started, before we go, I just want to warn you, we could get caught in a thunderstorm. We could get snowed on. This is Kathy Scott, the current project leader. It could be really cold and windy. And it's going to be steep and treacherous and not flat. So just putting that out there. Okay, so how are we going to get there? Well, luckily, the Park Service has been really generous to provide mule or pack support to carry all our equipment, including our tools, our food, which is great because it's, like I mentioned, it's really steep and rugged. So here we are making our way up the mountain, up to the pass, up to the high alpine soils. But unfortunately, we're gonna have to walk. And we're gonna have to walk really fast because we only have 10 minutes to get there. Okay, but hopefully we'll have some nice views on the way. This is again, looking down from the mountaintop down to the glacial valley. Oh, and we might have to stop and look at some plants on the way too. Okay, so the first area we're gonna visit is probably my favoriteest place in the park that I've been to. And it's this feature called Diamond Mesa. I found this photo on the Park Service website from 1935. And it's this erosional remnant that was above the glaciers. And here in 2015, when we visited, it hasn't changed that much. So you can see it's basically this diamond-shaped feature on the map. And we're going to look at a polemonium soil, which is a new series that we set up for the series, for the survey. This peak in the background is Junction Peak, which is the boundary between Sequoia and Kings Canyon. So now we're standing up on top of the mesa, and this is what the surface looks like. So let's take a look at the soil. This is the polemonium series. It's a sandy skeletal isodic tippet cryophytes. All of the soils above the mid-montane region in the park are isotic. And this particular soil is at an elevation of over 3,800 meters, and it's relatively flat. Some people might consider 18% not very flat, but for the park, it's pretty low slope. This soil is found on mesas and mountaintops or summit plateaus. And when we look at the horizons, it's got kind of a slope wash on the surface of coarse sand and gravel. And then it has this surprisingly well-developed A-horizon. And things are all relative here. So for a pile of sand and rocks, this A-horizon has vesicular pores, it has finer texture than you might expect. And I think a lot of this is due to freeze-thaw processes occurring because there's very little snow cover in this area. And then the rest of the soil is basically coarse sand and gravel. And I know it looks like there's a lot of coarse fragments in this particular pit, but this series has, in general, very few large rock fragments. And it supports the alpine vegetation. Here are some of the more photogenic ones. This is its namesake, Polemonium or sky pilot, and this alpine daisy or Holsia. Okay, so now we're going to journey over to Kearsarge Pass and look at a talus soil, which is this Canis rock series. This was a series set up in Yosemite. And I like this photo because it shows a patch of whitebark pine, and we're right on the edge of where it can grow vertically or in this Krumholtz form, which is more shrubby or horizontal. So this is the same species, and in high elevation or right at the border of tree line, it takes on this shrubby form. So this is very steep. It has a large cover of rock fragments, talus. So let's take a look. Here's our Canis rock series. It's sandy skeletal isotic typic hierophant, so the same classification as the Polemonium series, but it has a larger component of large rock fragments. And because of the colluvial nature of the soil rather than residual, as in the Polemonium series, it occurs on much steeper land forms, and it supports this Krumholtz vegetation. So here we have a thin O horizon from the conifers, a thin A horizon, a weakly developed EW horizon, and then this loose C material that is mostly rock fragments and angular rock fragments. And you can see by the shape of the pit, it's kind of loose and collapsing. Here's a whitebark pine that would be found on the pit. This tree is growing horizontally and it's probably 4 or 5 feet high, and they can get quite old. Pretty cool up there. Okay, so now again, those are our 2 unglaciated soils. So just for comparison, we're gonna go down into this glacial valley and look at this soil called Siberian, which is also a new series we set up for the park. And it's named after an area called Siberian Outpost in Sequoia National Park. So here's our landscape at our pit. Just, you look at this and it just makes you want to dig a pit. So that's what we did. And for all the rock fans, I just want to point out this pile of rocks here that came out of the pit. Gotta love till. Okay, so our Siberian series is a sandy skeletal isotic vitrandic cryothents. So down here in the subalpine region, we have a little bit of ash influence from volcanic centers to the east of the Sierra Crest. Again, we're on a more gently sloping landform, a moraine on the glacial valley floor. And this soil supports more large forest vegetation, although still relatively high and open. This soil is quite a bit more developed than the alpine soils. It has a thick O horizon from the forest canopy, a much thicker BW horizon, and then down in the subsurface, we get into this gray material, and then down here, even a densic horizon from glacial activity. So here's a example of the forest that supports either lodgepole or foxtail pine, this nice open forest in the subalpine region. Okay, so just to summarize some of the features of these soils. So we looked at 3 soils: polemonium on a mountaintop, Canis rocks on the talus slope, and Siberian on the glacial valley floor. These 2 were unglaciated. This one was glaciated. Our rock fragments changed from more angular to subrounded in the till. We went from mostly gravel in the residual soil to a mix of size fragments, including large fragments on the colluvial and till soils. Our texture becomes finer in the till soil, and then we go from loose consistence to a densic contact. So I hope you enjoyed your tour of the park. That's it. It's time to fill in the hole and go home. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Julie.
Hello, everyone. Am I live now?
Yes, we can hear you. We can see your slides.
Great, let's get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Randy Riddle. I'm the Soil Survey Office Leader in Templeton, California, and I'll be showing some soils and urban landscapes in the Los Angeles area, and particularly in the flight approach path into LAX, as if you're looking out the window of a plane. So we'll start out with a quick map to show the area. You can see the Los Angeles International Airport, sort of in the bottom left portion.
Randy, would you make your screen full? Would you make it full screen?
Yes, there we go.
Thank you.
Sure. There we go. So now you have a larger image of the LAX airport. So we're going to start on the eastern side of the map here and work our way back towards the beach. And the landing approach for the planes is also from east to west here. And then the takeoff path is out towards the ocean, and we'll circle back over to the continental U.S. Here's a different view of the same area so you can get an idea of the topography. This is a 3-meter digital elevation model with the hillshade. Just want to point out on the right side here, I have the Newport-Inglewood Fault labeled. This is responsible for the uplift in the hills that we'll be starting in, and basically uplifted alluvium from marine origin. And then as you move west, there's a series of terraces, and then the landscape picks back up as you move on into the sand dunes. So we'll start out with Sentinella soils, and these are on the uplifted alluvium, and also in what we'll call the bottom for simplicity. You can see the area highlighted in gray where those soils occur. And conceptually, the Sentinella soils, they have a thin surface layer or mantle of human transported materials, also what we call HTM, over alluvium from marine or mixed rock sources. And the classification for Sentinella is the fine smectitic thermic vertic haploxerips. So here's a TARP picture of the profile. Didn't have a good pit picture for this series in the flight approach area. So here that is, but you can see in the surface, there's sort of a loose, kind of more of an unconsolidated human transported materials at the surface with clay loam textures. It's less than 50 centimeters thick, so it does not meet the taxonomic criteria for human transported materials. And you can see that there's an intact subsoil with clay textures and calcium carbonate throughout the profile. If the transported materials were not at the surface, this would be a vertisol. And on the right here, you can see a typical landscape in the Inglewood area. And generally, the surface material is brought in to establish some sort of land cover, some sort of ornamental grass or things like that. So now we're going to move on slightly northwest over to a terrace position. And this is the wind fetch soil. This is also has a thin discontinuous layer of the HTM over the uplifted alluvium. And there's also some other source materials from mixed rock sources. Just north of this area, there is some sandstone that crops out in the Baldwin Hills, maybe a couple miles north of here. Classification of wind fetch is fine loamy, mixed, superactive, thermic, calcic, argizerols. And you can see there's some overlap with the Centinela series with the extent here. Generally, the wind fetch soil is going to be on the terraces. Stratigraphically, it occurs above or on top of the Centinela clays. So in areas where the wind fetch soil still exists or have not been weathered off post uplift, you'll find that. So here's the profile on the left here. We have about 30 centimeters of human transported materials. It's loam at the surface, or sort of a sod cap to establish the grass. And then there's some kind of locally reworked or locally graded materials from the area, and that's clay loam texture. And then below 30 centimeters is an intact argillic horizon with calcium carbonate masses. And we're only talking a few percent calcium carbonate equivalency with carbonates in the profile. On the right here, you can see a landscape picture of the terrace with a drainage way in the lower area with higher clay in that part of the landscape. So moving on to stop 3, and I know we're moving fast. I know for the sake of time, we're just talking broad concepts. This area in purple, we were able to correlate down to the series level in an anthropogenic soil. So we established the Sepulveda series, which is entirely formed in human transported materials. So here's a profile picture of the type location, which is actually a couple miles north of our tour, but I wanted to show this in an actual pit so you can see it. Conceptually, we have human transported materials greater than 1 meter. Often it's greater than 200 centimeters. And it's generally clean fill, 0 to 15% artifacts. So artifacts could be, it's usually construction debris, bricks, concrete, asphalt, things of that nature. Generally speaking, we're talking less than 5 or even 10% in most of the profiles. Classification is fine loamy, spolic, which is the human transported material family class, mixed, superactive, calcareous, thermic, typic, zero-orthents. So here's another tarp photo in the flight path area. And you can see here, actually, the surface is on the right side of the tarp. I know it looks, it's backwards, but it's closer to the hole, and that's just the way it worked out. So you can see we have a dark surface, and the color pattern looks, it closely resembles a natural profile. So you may be wondering, how can you tell if it's human transported materials? In this case, the horizons had an even thickness of about 30 centimeters. So we're talking about 10 inches thick each. And that was consistent throughout the whole profile. We also had asphalt artifacts between 60 and 95 centimeters. And also we had alternating soil textures in each one of those soil horizons throughout the profile, kind of bouncing between clay loams, and a thin layer with some clay in it as well. So you can see sort of what this landscape looks like on the right side. It's a large cut and fill terrace to establish this park area. And this is also consistent with many of the residential areas. Continuing moving west, there's a series of terraces that we drop down, and then we'll pick up into the sand dunes. So now you can see my mouse. We're just north of the airport runways here. Now we're on the stabilized dunes. and we'll be looking at the marina soils. So here's a profile picture of the TUD site used for the Los Angeles survey. And these are sandy soils on stabilized dune with lamellae. And it's a mixed thermic lamellic zero cements. So moving on to the flight path area, this is the actual field stop that's on the map I showed. I want to show you this profile here, and if you look at the image on the right, the aerial photography, you can see the density of the development in this area, and there's been quite a bit of surface movement to reshape the land for whatever development purposes were at the time. But the thing I want to point out here is you can easily see the lamella very close to the surface, even with this much development and earth movement. Essentially, the area was reshaped. There's about 10 centimeters of like a sod topsoil cap with sandy loam textures over locally reworked sands. So that's graded down to about 20 centimeters. And then below that, you can see the intact lamella throughout the rest of the profile below the depth of the auger after we're done taking these photos. But I just want to make that point that not all the soils in the city are transported or altered. In some cases, it's very thin. So you get a little bit of everything in these urban areas. And then continuing in a southwest fashion beyond the airport runway, this is actually in the takeoff zone. So the planes are taking off over your head here at stop 5. And now we're looking at the active dunes. And this is on the initial dune transition from the beach. And classification here is mixed thermic typic zero cements. If you look closely in the profile, you can see some bits of concrete in here. If you can see my mouse, and there's also brick fragments. There were 5% fragments in this profile on the surface horizon, and approximately 8% down to about 50 centimeters. And also want to point out that in this type of situation, transported materials are not significantly different than the native profile. Here we have a landscape shot on the left from that photo, and you can see that there's been some grading done here. And there was actually existing homes that were demolished, I believe in the 50s or 1960s when the LAX airport was expanded. So the planes weren't taking off directly overhead of housing. So those were all demolished, and this is the site that remains today. And for contrast, on the right, I wanted to show the same landscape in a developed area in Manhattan Beach. This area is very impervious, has about 80% surface cover or surface ceiling with concrete and asphalt and buildings, things of that nature. So I want to thank you all for your attention. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. I'd be happy to answer anything. And if I covered anything too quickly, feel free to shoot me an email. I have my email here on the bottom right. And have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy.
Can you see my screen? Hello?
Yes, yes, we can.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to welcome to Utah. This tour is organized mainly by Mr. Randy Lewis, and I asked him to present, but he wanted me to present. So this is a typical MLRA 28A Katina located in Miller County, Utah. MLRA 28A in Utah has been influenced by Pleistocene Lake Bonneville. Lake Bonneville was roughly about 300 miles long and 150 miles across, and it started around 30,000 years ago. This lake filled completely about 18,000 years ago, and it broke through the Red Rock Pass in Idaho, flooding into the Snake River Plain. In this map, all these blue shaded areas, it shows the Pleistocene lakes in Nevada, Utah. But I just want you to focus here. This is the Lake Bonneville, and this shade here, which is the present day Great Salt Lake. This Lake Bonneville slowly dried to current Great Salt Lake level around 13,000 years ago. And this Great Salt Lake is the remnant of this Lake Bonneville. And Lake Bonneville left fingerprints on western Utah with different levels of lake terraces along the mountain ranges, leaving large gravelly deposits on its fringes, grading to marly silt and clay deposits in the center. So basically, the reason why I'm bringing this Lake Bonneville concept is all the soils in western Utah has some kind of influence due to the Lake Bonneville. This aerial view here, you can see this area here, Bonneville Lake Terrace at the maximum fill. And this area is the pre-Bonneville fan remnants. And here you can see V-shaped barriers formed progressively as Bonneville filled. And somewhere here, you can see Provo level lake terrace formed after Bonneville flood. And you can see this white exposures is the lacustrine, which is Lake Marl sediment exposures. And this is the Great Salt Lake picture. And this Katina for the MLRA 28A, you can see the relationship between the landscape, soil, parent material, and vegetation. If you see in the very high hills and mountains, you can see this M-top, which is the aridisol, and this is also aridisols on the little kind of lower slope area. But these both are the aridisols, but this one is the lithic geric haplocalcites, and this one is the lithic geric haploargid. So with the arzelic horizon in this area, but another difference between these two soils, if you test with the acids, it violently effervesces. So the reaction is very violent in terms of effervescence, and the calcium carbonate equivalent from the higher horizons to the lower horizons is kind of increasing up to about 75%, somewhere here around maybe 59% or 60%. But this one with the arzelic horizon and the calcium carbonate is very mild reactions in this soil profile. But if you move down in the upper fan remnant to the lower fan remnant and all the way to the dunes, so you can see these are all intisols. But even within the intisols from upper fan remnant to the dunes area, so as dunes suggest, so this is all typic Torrey salmon, so sandy profile and very dry, hot. But over here, it is typic torrid orthents. So it's pretty much the kind of similar soil. Only here is like A and the C. So it's as intisols, very young soils with the A and the C horizons. And then when you move down to the lake terrace and the lake plain, again, you can see arid soils with typical nitroargis, which is natric horizons and argillic horizons, if you can see in this soil profile. And then here in the lake plain, you can see this is a typical aquasalids. It is more of a hydric soils. And so you can see this area, bedrock, and the alluvium and the colluvium type of parent material. And then all the way down here is more on lacustrine. And down here, corresponding to the landscape position, you can expect semi-desert with blue bunch wheatgrass, then semi-desert, this black sagebrush, and then desert alkali bench, which is you can find some kind of bud sagebrush. Then on the desert, another area here, sage scale, then winter flat, the desert silty flat, alkali flat, which is more of a black grayswheat on the dunes areas. And then all the way down here in the lake plain, you can expect desert silty silt, and this is the palaya, which is more swampy, more wet areas. And I would like you to see some of the landscapes. So this is the picture of high mountain sites where you can expect this Amtoft and the Chiquet soil in these areas. And this is the rock outcrops with the mountain slope, all these kind of sage, these shrublands and the junipers. And this is more of semi-desert areas, all the sagebrushes here. And this is the lake terraces with tufa draping over the terrace edges. So another picture is the palaya areas at lowest elevations of the closed basin landscape. In the next drawing sequence along lake plains, this is more of aquasalis form. And this is the nitroargis, which is the natric horizons on the lake plain. You can expect grayswood areas in alkali flat, so mostly just out of hydric soil condition. And this is the desert sites under sage scale, bord sagebrush, orphans, durites, calcite type of soils you can expect. And then the vegetation like desert soil communities located on upper lake plains, lower alluvial fans, inset fans, and the lower lake terraces. So mostly typical acidic type of soil. And this is the picture which shows the marl deposits left on the basin floor. And I would also like you to see some of the soil profiles. So this is the Scump soil series under an alkali flat, which is a nitroargis. And this is the close-up for the natric horizon kind of in the bottom horizon. And this is the durites under desert shallow loam site. And this is the haplocalcites under a semi-desert gravelly loam. So mostly calcium carbonate in this kind of profile. And this is all the way down to the lake plain, which is the aquasalids, as I showed you earlier, which is the salt air series soil under the desert salt silt. And this is the presentation I have. And if you have anything, just let me know. I'll be glad to answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Beer.
Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for the Oregon Virtual Field Trip, Mount Mazama Forested Anissoles. My name is Anthony Calora. I'm an MLRA soil scientist in Redmond, Oregon, And joining me will be Katie Chambers, an MLRA soil scientist in Klamath Falls. Special thanks to Corey Owens, Thor Thorson, Sarah Hash, Gina Rohn, Chris Gebauer, and Kurt Moffitt.
Mount Mazama was one of the major volcanoes in the Cascade Arc, and possibly the largest volcano in Oregon during its time. It had an elevation estimate of 12,000 feet. 7,700 years ago, a violent eruption emptied the magma chamber beneath the mountain, causing the mountain to collapse in on itself and creating a caldera. This caldera is now known as Crater Lake National Park. The eruption was so powerful that it sent pyroclastic flows 43 miles downslope, sent ash into the atmosphere, which was eventually deposited as far as Canada. I want to bring your attention to the map down in the left corner. The yellow oval is the boundary of Mount Mazama ash. Within that boundary, there is a little yellow ribbon that depicts the Mount St. Helens ash deposit from the 1980 eruption. Some of you might remember how much havoc that eruption caused. It's just mind-boggling to think about how big this eruption would have been. Crater Lake formed in the caldera after the Mount Mazama eruption. It is the United States' deepest lake and the world's 9th deepest lake. It is a closed basin. It has no inlet and no outlet. All the water that is accumulated came from snowmelt or rain.
As we travel down the slopes of Mount Mazama, we will encounter the ash and pumice-influenced landscapes that are home to our unique forested andisols. These soils cover a vast geographic extent and occur on a variety of different pumice-mantled landforms. These three soils give us a very basic catena as we travel down the forested slopes of Mount Mazama and onto the lava plateaus of Central Oregon. The diagram at the bottom roughly corresponds to the depth of ashfall and pumice deposits in these three soils. Closest to Mount Mazama and at higher elevations, we find the Timber Crater series, a very deep, excessively drained, ashy pumiceous, amorphic typic vitrocryand. Timber Crater meets the ashy pumiceous particle size class by having andic soil properties and greater than or equal to 35% coarse fragments, of which 2/3 or more is pumice. And in reality, once we dig down to the sea horizons, the pumice ranges anywhere from 70 to 95% of the volume. These soils occur in a eutic soil moisture regime and have a slightly higher degree of weathering associated with them when compared to Alpine. The Alpine series, which we'll further explore in a moment, has the largest extent of any soil series in Oregon. Roughly 130,000 acres mapped in published surveys and 430,000 total acres if we include the unpublished data in initial soil survey areas. Alpine is a very deep, somewhat excessively drained, ashy pumiceous, glassy, xeric vitrocryand. These soils also meet the same ash and pumice particle size control section criteria as the Timber Crater. Some soils will have a buried paleosol, which shows up below the lower boundary of the particle size control section. Alpine has a xeric soil moisture regime and associated glassy mineralogy. Lastly, the Shukash series occurs in areas with slightly less accumulations of volcanic ash. These soils have a contrasting family particle size class of ashy over loamy skeletal. The top portion of the control section is volcanic ash that contains less than 35% rock fragments and pumice, and the lower portion of the control section is the buried loamy skeletal paleosol. All of these soils occur in the southern portion of MLRA 6, which is the Cascade Mountains' eastern slopes. This map just goes to show the scale of the Mount Mazama eruption and its influence on the soils today. So we can reasonably assume that all the yellow to orange colors, which is the sandy materials, are coming from Mount Mazama, and we do have KSSL lab data to support this.
The Alpine soil series was established in 1946 and was classified as an entisol, cindery typic cryorthent, and could not be classified as an andept because it lacked consistent dark color in the surface horizons. Instead, it had both dark color and light color. Soil scientists nicknamed this salt and pepper effect, and therefore an ochre gappy pattern was assigned. The textures were too coarse to have a cambic horizon, and no diagnostic horizon was assigned. The term cindery was used to describe pumice fragments because that was the best fit that they had. And therefore the horizon textures were called gravel and very gravelly. But this did not reflect the true nature of pumice fragments or the Alpine soil series. In 1985, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho soil scientists joined the International Committee on Andesols. The following year, soil scientists from all over the world came to the first International Soil Correlation Meeting in the Pacific Northwest. In the mid-80s, soil scientists collected soil data on Steiger and Shanahan because they did not want soils such as Alpine and Steiger and Shanahan to be endosols. They wanted them to be part of the new soil order andesols. So the lower limit of P retention, iron, aluminum concentrations were set for andic soil properties. In 1988, the final andesol proposal was submitted, and pararock fragments were recognized as describing pumice fragments. In 1991, Alpine soil series was reclassified as an andesol. Ashy, pumiceous, xeric, vitricrian. In 1999, texture and horizon nomenclature was changed. Paragravel and ashy was added to the textures. The AC horizon was renamed to a BW because it had andic soil properties and therefore some weathering had occurred.
Andesols in this region have some unique soil properties that we don't typically associate with the more highly weathered andesols common to areas like western Washington or Hawaii. Soils like Alpine are made up of young and less weathered sandy dacitic ash and pumice. These soils have very little development past the rooting zone, which is normally the upper 30 to 50 centimeters. The low soil development can be attributed to its young age, its xeric soil moisture regime, and its cryotic temperature regime. So during the summer months, precipitation is limited. And then when moisture is available, typically arriving in the form of snowfall, the temperatures are below biologic zero. Additionally, these soils have some unique thermal properties. The pumice causes the soil to have a large diurnal temperature variation. This means on a hot summer day, the soil surface can warm up very quickly and then cool off rapidly during the night. Pair this with the naturally undulating volcanic landscapes where these soils occur, and we get cold air drainages and frost pockets that last well into the growing season. The ash and pumice materials also have low volume weight and high porosity. These soils have relatively higher water holding capacity when we compare them to mineral soils of the same sandy texture. And volcanic ash also naturally has low inherent fertility. So really, understanding all these unique soil properties is critical to maintain productive and healthy forests.
The pine soil series are predominantly forested. Two common plant associations are lodgepole pine, antelope bitterbrush, which dominate depressions and flat areas, and ponderosa pine, greenleaf manzanita, which are associated with higher landscape positions where the risk of frost is lower. The primary management concern is to minimize soil surface disturbance and to protect that organic duff layer. Protecting the soil surface of any forest is important, but is more critical with these soils because they have weak soil development and low fertility. What nutrients the soils have are primarily found in the top 30 to 50 centimeters. Displacement or mixing of the soil surface can reduce the productivity and the ecosystem services. We welcome any questions that you may have.
So, Anthony and Katie, thank you very much.
So hi everybody, I'm Nick Jelinski, University of Minnesota. Colby, just yell at me if my screen's not sharing correctly. So I'm going to share some soils from the Central Copper River Basin. These soils are gelisols. For those of you who are not aware of where the Copper River Basin is in Alaska, it's kind of in the southern part of the zone of discontinuous permafrost. And predominantly, the landforms in this basin was essentially formed from glacial lacustrine sediments. So this is an intermontane basin bounded by the Alaska Range on the north, the Wrangell Mountains to the east, the Chugach to the south, and the Talkeetnas to the west. And this basin was filled up by a proglacial lake or proglacial lakes repeatedly over the course of the Pleistocene, because mountain glaciers in the Chugach Range plugged up the southern outlet of the Copper River, which is the main drainage running down through the basin. And so a series of proglacial lakes over the Pleistocene developed. Huge amounts of glacial lacustrine sediments were deposited. I'm going to show you some soils from the central part of the basin here, but the lakes themselves would have occupied huge portions of this basin during certain times. The Copper River itself has subsequently incised down through those glacial lacustrine sediments. You can see on the right, here's the Copper River. The flat uplands, which were the bottom of the lake bed, that's where the permafrost affected soils are. So there's large, extensive black spruce forests, black and white spruce forests up here, mostly where the gelisols are. There are no gelisols in the floodplains really, or any of the slopes, and as you get up to the more mountainous areas. So really focusing on the central part of the basin. Fire is extremely important. It's a critical factor in spruce forest soils, and particularly in the Copper River Basin. The fire return intervals here are somewhat longer than those of parts of the Alaskan interior, just because there's fewer lightning strikes. But the estimated fire return intervals are on the order of centuries, 150 to 500 years or so. We sampled 44 permafrost affected soils in this part of the Copper River Basin, 22 under what we called late successional black spruce, which are these spruce stands that range from like 175 to more than 250 years old, to kind of post-fire black spruce. In this particular area, the most recent fire was about 100 years ago, and so we got some stand ages between 90 to 120 years. Burn sites tend to have thinner surface organic materials. Organic layers are really common on the surface, and so burn sites tend to have fewer, thinner organic materials, even if they're relatively old, in this case, over a century. And the permafrost is typically deeper on sites that have been burned more recently. But it's thought that under a stable climate, there's kind of a cyclical progression to how these soils might change. So fire leads to kind of burn phase where the organics might be thinner, the permafrost might be deeper, followed by recovery over a period of decades, maybe centuries, assuming some sort of stable climate. So I'll show you some of the morphological features that we might see if we were looking at some of these gelisols. As you're digging down through the soil, the top part of the soil is the active layer. That's the zone that freezes and then thaws during the growing season. So it's above the permafrost. And in the active layer, it's very common to find cryogenic soil structures. So these are soil structures that are formed by ice segregation, which means that there's essentially been ice, either lenses or seams, that have pushed the soil particles apart and reinforced these structures. So really common cryogenic soil structures are platy structures where you might have had ice lenses, or even fine and very fine angular blocky structures can be really well developed. And these are all due to ice segregation in the active layer. In the near surface permafrost, we would describe cryostructures. So cryostructures are different from cryogenic soil structure. Cryogenic soil structure being really the structure of the soil aggregates formed by ice segregation, but cryostructure describing the structure and pattern of the ice itself, not the soil aggregates. And so you can see on the right here, I've got examples of some very common cryostructures that we would find in these gelisols in the central Copper River Basin. So suspended cryostructures where the minerals themselves are suspended in a matrix of ice. Lenticular, where we have ice lenses. Microlenticular, where the lenses are thinner. And then massive pore ice. This is where there is ice. These are frozen materials and they're cemented by ice, but the ice is just in the pores. It's not segregated and pushing the minerals apart. So you almost don't see it, but it's still there. And generally these are more ice rich towards the top here, and get less ice-rich towards the bottom. And you tend to have the ice-rich cryostructures closest to the top of the permafrost. And that's because water migrates to the freezing front. So every year, if there's some water that's going downwards through the profile, it'll actually preferentially migrate towards the freezing front and lead to ice-rich permafrost generally near the surface. Another really common morphological feature that we would find in these soils is cryoturbation. So these soils are actually cryoturbated, they're frost churned. There's a lot of morphological evidence of cryoturbation in these soils. You can see on the right here, I have examples of just some shallow holes there, and then also some cores where you can see the mixing of organic rich materials with mineral materials due to freeze-thaw processes. In these soils, there's a lot of different mechanisms of cryoturbation. In these soils, it's likely due to both the upward movement of material, less dense materials, ice-rich, less dense materials, if they melt, they can move upwards, and also the solutioning or downward movement of really saturated organic materials through macropores. So I just want to show you some examples of soils we might find under late successional black spruce. This is a pretty typical late successional black spruce soil, shallow permafrost, thick organics. The organics are increasingly decomposed with depth. They're fairly transitional to mineral materials. There's some really tweeners, whether or not it's an organic or mineral soil material. And these tend to be well insulated soils with thick organic materials over really clay, fine glacial lacustrine sediments. Some take-homes. Basically, the thickness of the organic matter, of the organic layer really controls the depth to permafrost. So the thicker the organics that you have on the surface in the late successional black spruce, then the shallower the permafrost is going to be. And that's just because those organics are insulating the soils throughout the growing season. Also, organic layer thickness really controls carbon stocks. So the thicker the organic layer, the greater the 1 meter organic carbon stocks, and there's a really strong relationship there because some of those organics do have so much carbon in them. If we contrast those late successional sites with soils under post-fire, and here by post-fire, the sites that we've investigated are about 100 years following some type of fire event. Typically, the permafrost table is deeper, average of maybe 30 centimeters deeper on post-fire sites compared to late successional sites. The organic layer is about the same on average. I'm showing you an example of one that's thinner, but actually after about 100 years, we found that the organic layer thickness has recovered. And the patterns of cryoturbation, cryogenic soil structures, and cryostructures are pretty similar with those of late successional sites. But a big take home is that the organic layer thickness, even though it's recovered, the carbon stocks in the post-fire sites have not yet recovered. So this is just a graph here of organic layer thickness versus carbon stocks in the top meter for the late successional sites where there's a strong relationship. And then these white dots are post-fire sites. So carbon stocks are still lower under post-fire sites, and there's no relationship between organic layer thickness and carbon stocks in those post-fire sites. Part of the reason for that is because the composition of the organic materials on average is different between the late successional and post-fire sites. So late successional sites are more likely to have well-decomposed sapric or even organic mineral transitional materials, and those have higher carbon densities. So even though the thickness of the organics might be similar, the higher carbon density of more well-decomposed organics really boosts the carbon stocks. So the big question is, are these post-fire sites on the road to recovery in our kind of modern era? And so on the right here, we've just got some stand ages versus one meter carbon stocks. And the post-fire sites are fairly low. You can see that there appears to be some sort of trajectory going towards late successional sites in terms of carbon recovery. And the big question is, whether in a changing climate that recovery will occur. So will these carbon stocks ever be like they are in the late successional sites that haven't burned for over 200 years? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on how fire return intervals change, and it depends on how climate changes. If we believe that they are on the road to recovery, then it looks like maybe another 100 years or so might allow for full recovery of those carbon stocks. So there's a lot of folks that help collect this data, dig these soil pits and observe these things in the field. A lot of collaborators from ATNA, students, staff, a lot of collaborators from NRCS staff, and discussions with retirees, Mark Clark and Chinlu Ping. And I just want to highlight, if anybody's interested, I've got a couple papers we can send you, one that was published last year and another that's currently in review with the Canadian Journal of Forest Research. So I'm happy to take any other questions in the chat. Thanks.
Thank you, Nick.
Okay, aloha everybody. This is Amy reporting to you from the Hilo Forest Reserve in Hawaii. Let's see if I can get into. All right, I hope you brought your boots today because we're going to a very wet area in the Hilo Forest Reserve on the island of Hawaii. It's an intact native forest, and I point that out because we don't have many of those. We have such a problem with invasive species, so this is a really cool area with a really nice katina of soils with some really cool soil and like vegetation correlation. So here we are on the island of Hawaii. It's the youngest island in Hawaii in the island chain. So we've moved southwest from Alaska across the ocean. We are on Mauna Kea, which is the second oldest of the 5 volcanoes that make up the island. And you can see the outline of the Hilo Forest Reserve there on the right. So here's a slope map to kind of give you a little bit of orientation. Generally, there's some pretty level to gently sloping areas. It gets a little steeper in the northern areas. And I want to point out some of these steep drainages. You can see the blue showing up for very steep. There's not a lot of surface drainage. This is a huge catchment area for a lot of rainfall that we get on this side of the island, which I'll get to next. And so there's through flow through the soil, and then it comes out into these really steep, narrow gulches. So speaking of rainfall, mean annual precipitation, 5,840 millimeters, approximately 300 inches, 230 to 300 inches of rain. So it's a lot of water. We're on the what we call the windward side of Hawaii Island. So we get trade winds that bring in the moisture across the mountain, and it kind of sits at, you know, the mid elevation, the mid flank of Mauna Kea, and rains, and eventually kind of backs up to the coast area at the end of the day. So here's a bird's eye view of what you would see looking up towards beautiful Mauna Kea. It's a shield volcano with some late stage activity that's put some pu'us or cinder cones. You can see the native forest there. The overstory is koa, and also some ohia, and then uluhe. Okay, so here is a cross section of what we're looking at. We have 64,000 to 300,000 year old lava flows. So very, very young compared to what we've looked at elsewhere today. Those lava flows are covered by a blanket of weathered volcanic ash. You can see here it's a depth of about 6 kilometers to the seafloor. And this is just kind of what the area looks like. So today we're going to talk about 3 different soils that are occurring in the Hilo Forest Reserve. We have the Kaiviki, Akaka, and Onamea series. They occur in various combinations depending on the terrain. You can see on the left what that looks like. The steeper areas have higher percentages of the Kaiviki series, which is the well-drained component, and minor components of the Akaka and the Onamea. There are areas that are less steep, that catch more water, and they have a complex of the Akaka, which is moderately well drained, and Kaiviki, with some minor components of the Onomea series. Then there's these nearly level areas and depressions, which are a relic of the actual landscape of the lava flows. And so they serve as a catchment area for water, and they're dominated by the Onomea series, which is very poorly drained, with some minor components of Kaiviki and Akaka. So here's a cross section. You can again see the lava flow covered by the volcanic ash. Up here, you're gonna have the Kaiviki series, followed by your Akaka series, shown there on the foot slopes, and then down in the depressional areas, you're gonna have the Onomea series. And all that water is gonna drain into the stream channels. So this just shows a little bit about a rain event. Here you have rain coming in, you have infiltration and recharge. I'm gonna point out there's a winter water table as well as a summer water table. Our rainy season goes from October through March. And there's also a lot of through flow that comes through the soil and then discharges. So here's just a little, this is an infrared photo showing some of the signatures that come up with the various combinations of these three series. So here I just wanted to point out how you can kind of pick out the different series based on that vegetation, soil, landscape relationship. You can also see these steep drainages kind of coming through and dissecting the area, going out towards the ocean, carrying all that water out to the ocean. Blue are areas of Kaiviki, which again is the well-drained. Green areas are Onomea, which are kind of boggy areas and are poorly drained. And then you have your moderately well-drained with the Akaka series, which is the yellow. I will note that it's a periodic moisture regime here, which means that the precipitation exceeds evapotranspirations throughout the year. And then you can see there the mean annual air temperature, 13 to 20 degrees C. We're looking at isothermic soils here. So again, just talking a little bit more about the vegetation relationships, the Akaka tends to have what we call luhe fern. It's the native fern, kind of creeps and crawls along the ground, as well as small stature ohia trees. The Kaiviki has more of a established forest with akoa and ohia trees and what we call hapu'u tree ferns on the understory. And then the Onomea is dominated by grasses, sedges, and some aluhe fern, but it's mostly really wet, and that's what you're kind of looking at in my background picture from my video feed. So here we go. This is the aluhe fern. You can see it kind of crawling up some of the old ohia that are dying off, and there's some younger ones that are coming, but they're generally not very tall just because of the limitations of the water. This is a little bit more established area of ohia. This is what it would look like if you're in the actual forest. This is a hapu'u tree fern. It's pretty precarious to walk around through these areas. You're tromping around with a machete, and but it's beautiful at the same time. And this is the boggy area. In addition to the sedges and grasses that occur here, there are some natives that occur in kind of a miniature form, which is kind of interesting and fun. So a little bit more about the three series. The Kaiviki series, again, is highly weathered volcanic ash. It's going to be on slopes 2 to 10%. It's going to have runoff. It's well drained is the main thing. And there's no real high water table that's an issue. I do want to point out, you can kind of see this is a very classic andesol. I'll do the taxonomy in the next slide, but you can see all the different layers of ash deposits, and this kind of right around 30 centimeters coming through is likely a buried surface horizon, richer in organic carbon, and then another event would have deposited this ash on top. So here's the taxonomic class: hydrous, very hydritic, isothermic, acrodoxic hydrodans. Typical profile there is shown. And you can see again, this is a well-drained soil. The Ecological series, also highly weathered volcanic ash. This one is going to have a moderately well drained, and it's going to have a seasonal high water table around 50 centimeters in the winter and a little bit deeper at 80 centimeters in the summer. And the Ecological series is a hydrospheric hydritic isothermic acrodoxic hydrodan. So you'll see, even though it has that seasonal water table, it's actually through flow for the most part, so that water isn't sitting there long enough to create reduced conditions. So that's why it does not go into the aquic regime. It stays in the periodic. And the Onamea series, this actually does have a cap of organic material over, again, that highly weathered volcanic ash, much lower slopes, very poorly drained. Basically, it's wet to the surface year round. When this picture was taken, it was the middle of the summer and a pretty dry summer. And when you walk around, it's pretty squishy, hence the need for the boots. So the taxonomic class of this one is, of course, it's underneath, oops, sorry, underneath my, where I'm sharing, but this is the hydrous isothermic histic endoaquan, and you can see kind of where there is still through flow through this, but you're getting more of the organics in the surface and some glaying in the subsoil. So with that, thank you. This is a picture of me many years ago when I actually got to still be happy and go out and get dirty. But yeah, happy to take questions in the chat. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Amy, and thank you for everyone that's presented. Been amazed at the amount and the variability that's across the Western U.S. We're now going to move on briefly. We'll now move on to the question and answer portion of our session today. I know there's been, I've been watching the chat dialogue. There's been some questions asked and many answered. I'd still like to go back through each presenter that has had questions asked. Even if you've answered partially the question that in the chat window, I'd like to have you just respond at least to the initial question that was asked in the chat window. So we're going to start with Stuart Veith. The first question asked was, how did the Scoby series start as fine loamy and then become fine?
Kobe, it looks like Stuart left. I don't see him on the list.
Okay, so it looks like he's left. Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to our next presenter. Rob, I had a question for you. You mentioned that sky islands affect the natural vegetation as you move up in elevation. Can you explain a little bit about how the elevation influences the soils that you find in the Huachuca Mountains?
Sure, yeah. So the elevational gradient, as we go up in elevation, we also, our annual precip increases and temperature decreases. So that certainly affects our climate classifications for soils. And yeah, also the vegetation, as we go up in elevation, starting at that grass, semi-desert grassland sea around the Sky Island and moving up into Madrean evergreen woodland and then conifer forest. So.
Thank you. Do you see an interaction between climate and parent material or the geological type?
Climate and geological type. Well, certainly we see valley fill or alluvium, and mostly corresponds with that semi-desert grassland. And then sort of depends on what sky island you're in, because they all have slightly different formation geologic history. So we see a lot of predominantly igneous intrusive granitic intrusions and stocks and things in the mountains. But there was that thrust faulting in the Huachucas that led to the sedimentary rocks being pushed up high. So.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
Next question is for Dan. Dan, do you think that the calcium carbonate is related to Pleistocene hydrology in that drainage?
I think he had the question worded a little differently there, but Stuart did. You there? Hey.
Oh, all right, I'm here.
Oh, hey. So, yeah, his original question was kind of like more related to petrocalcics on paleo terraces, I think. So, how it typically works, at least in that soil survey area, is we have the highest, geomorphically highest landforms will have the most calcium carbonate formation, like as in petrocalcics, petronodes, that kind of formation. And as we move down the into the valley floor, we'll gradually lose calcium, or there will be less calcium carbonate development. For the Todd Hole series, yes, if you think it's from Pleistocene hydrology, I think it is. It's definitely receiving some kind of enrichment or carbonate enriched water, I believe, and that subsequent drying period in the late summer fall is leading to accretion. That's what I think. I don't know, did that answer your question?
Yes, yes, it did. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. Next two questions was for Julie. Julie, the question was asked, do you think the A horizon material with the vesicular pore and the Polomium series could be aeolian, possibly from the east side of the Sierras?
Yeah, I think that's probably a good explanation for that A horizon. So that soil on the mountaintops and mesas is probably considerably older than any of the surrounding soils. And the textures in that horizon are much finer, have like very fine sandy loams, or even loams, in contrast to the coarse sands that you find in most of the profile. So I think, yeah, there's probably some aeolian influence.
Okay. And then the second question asked was, did you come across any paraglacial soils in your mapping when you were up high?
We did not. So I would imagine that those soils up high, well, the ones that would experience those big temperature swings and the really cold temperatures in the winter that are windswept and don't have the snow cover, they're really coarse textured. And they're also sort of slowly falling down the mountain. So I don't think there's much there to like hold together and make any residual features.
Thank you. The next question is a question I had for Randy. There in the LA basin, you had shown the soil with the lamellae in the highly developed area. Do you think those lamellae are still forming? Or are those now sealed off and no longer active?
That's a good question. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest with you, but most of that landscape has been sealed or modified at the surface. So it's hard to tell really how much of the surface was scalped before it was before the transported materials were laid back in. So it's hard to say. One thing I'll add, we did sample the Marina series, which is the profile with the lamella, and pretty large clay increase in the lamella. I think it was something like 7 or 8%, even though it was still loamy sand, and had a pretty high SAR value too. But besides that, I'm not 100% sure if it's still forming or at what rate.
Okay. Do you, just from based on your experience in urban, peri-urban environments, or densely urban environments, once that soil is sealed off, do you still see any petagenesis happening?
Yeah, sorry, I thought I was on mute. Yes, absolutely. Especially in the surface horizons, you can pretty clearly see structure development near the surface, and also organic accumulation. Sometimes it's a hard call to figure out how deep the redevelopment of that profile has moved down, because some of the original properties are retained even through its transport from the source materials. So you do see both. But yes, there's certainly surface petagenesis that's evident and very clear to see.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't ever I haven't ever worked in that type of environment, so it's something, live in it, but don't ever think about it too much, oddly enough. So thank you. The next question was for both Anthony and Katie. In the upper 2 meters of the area that you've examined, did you find multiple weathered tephra units since the Mount Mazama eruption?
So no, in that area where our presentation was focused, the only volcanic event was Mount Mazama. However, I did mention that in Central Oregon there is another recent volcanic event, which is Newberry Volcano. That was about 1,300 years ago, so we do have some influence. It's much smaller in size, but that's a little bit more towards the northeast.
Do you see layered tephra in the soils around Mount Hood?
I'm not sure. I've never worked in that area.
Okay. All righty. Thank you. So that's the end of the questions. There is ongoing discussion in this in the chat, so I will leave that open. But thank you all so very much for participating in today's virtual field trip. Even though we didn't get to go out in the field per se, I think we got to see a large number of soils that we would have not otherwise seen. So thank you all for your participation, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks, Colby.
Yes, thank you.